Welcome to the Death Doula Duo. I'm Jennifer O'Neill.
And I'm Sarah Kovash.
And this is where we explore the profound mysteries of life and all things death.
Hello, hello.
Hi.
Welcome back to the Death Doula Duo podcast, where we explore all things death. Don't know if I could get that out. It's been a while. It's been a long time since we've been in this studio, so I'm glad to be back.
Yeah, me too.
And again, where we explore all things death, because talking about death helps us live a fuller life. Today, we have the honor of speaking with John Ireland of John M. Ireland and Son Funeral Home and Chapel. John is a third-generation funeral director, carrying forward not only a family legacy, but a lifetime of witnessing how families love, grieve, remember, and heal. We are so excited to talk to you today. We'd love to talk to you about your childhood growing up in the funeral industry.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's a delight to be here. And a little bit about myself. I was fortunate. My father started out in the funeral business when he was 16 years old. And he ended up going to mortuary school on the GI Bill. And as time went on, my dad developed a knack to be able to turn funeral homes around that were in trouble. And so we moved quite often. My dad loved the challenge, and every time someone would call my dad and say, hey, I've got a problem here or problem there, my dad would drive up and visit with him. And my mom would always say, we could be moving again if your dad loves that town, because he loves a challenge. And sure enough, that happened. And but anyway, my dad was a guy that was always got very involved in the community. And he was a great teacher. And I probably didn't realize he was teaching me since I was about the second grade. And years ago, a lot of people don't realize this, and it's showing my age because I'm 64. If you ever needed an ambulance, you call the local funeral home. And many funeral homes years ago, back in the 60s and 70s, even here in Oklahoma, all had ambulance service. And so how funeral homes used to promote the funeral business was through their ambulance. And I can remember we would hand out little decals that would glow in the dark that you would mount to your old phone receiver. And they would have 4 numbers on there. They would have for an ambulance, police, fire, and the 4th number could have been animal control. I'm not for sure. You could call the dog catcher. But we would promote the ambulance service. And we used to advertise in it 2-way radio and oxygen equipped. And wow. And that's how a lot of funeral homes did. And of course, if someone was always calling you for your ambulance, say, people are in their 70s and they need to go in for a checkup. Maybe they were diabetic, whatever the case may be, and they called your ambulance. When you ever needed funeral service, you would hope they would call your funeral home because they used your ambulance. And I can remember we used to just get $15 for an ambulance run. Wow. And a lot of times we wouldn't bill people.
Did it have your name on the ambulance?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. You had your name. Some painted their name right down the fender of the ambulance. Some had, signs in the windows. And,
so if it doesn't work out so well on the ambulance, then...
Well, they may be a guaranteed customer after that.
Here's the thing. Now think about this. Think about this, to how it has changed so much.
Yeah.
This has changed. Not just my dad, but a lot of funerals would do this. You would go to the sheriff and put money in his election, and then he would give you a radio to put in your ambulance, and the sheriff's department would dispatch for you. Now think about this. Whether it's a weekend, a Friday night, maybe there was a shooting, a homicide, there was no such thing as a medical examiner years ago picking up a deceased. So if the sheriff department called you and said, we found someone passed away in a farmhouse out here, and you called, you took the deceased back to the funeral home. And when the sheriff department went to the home and told the family, you know, hey, we found a loved one passed away, and he's at the Ireland funeral home. Well, you knew you were going to get that call. Mm-hmm. So the ambulance service was a tool to build your funeral home, especially if there was a car wreck. If you went to a wreck and the people didn't survive the wreck, you took the deceased back to the funeral home.
Did the ambulance people work for the funeral home? So
there was no such thing. There was no such thing as an ambulance person. I mean, you could be.
It was the funeral home.
You could be outside the funeral home mowing the yard, getting
ready. You weren't
ready.
an EMT then.
No, there was no such thing as that. The only first aid you had was a little oxygen tank that was right there next to the cot, and a lot of times we used station wagons. We got a new station wagon and we would drive. I remember one. I don't know why we ended up in Springfield, Missouri. But my mom, I was the youngest of 4 kids, and my mom and dad and I drove to Springfield, Missouri, and we bought a new white Mercury Marquis station wagon. And the gentleman actually loaned us a car to go eat, and we came back. He had taken the back seat of the station wagon and cut a seat out of it. In other words, part of the seat would lay down, but this other little seat would flip up, and you rode next to the patient.
Oh, wow. So they were either alive or not. Because if they were alive, you took them to the hospital.
Absolutely.
And if they weren't,
absolutely,
to the funeral home. Okay.
And a lot of times I can remember, and I'm not talking out of school here, it's just the way it was. And
yeah, that's something I think a lot of people don't know.
No, I didn't know that. You told me that when we met, and that was a story I'd never heard before.
And I have to tell you, when someone called for an ambulance, and if you knew the family, and there's many times, to be quite frank with you, my dad always had a theory, never be the blunt of bad news, because they're not going to forgive you for what, even though you were trying to help them, right. Don't be the blunt of bad news. And we would get to a house, people would call the funeral home, and sometimes when people would call them then, it was just a matter of if they knew my dad or they knew our family. But let's say, for example, I'm trying to give you an example here. Say we had a funeral going on and we were going down, my dad and 1 or 2 of the guys were working the funeral. They were going down, the secretary stepped out. My dad would call our residence, our home, because there's no such thing as call forwarding. Right. So if you had a phone at the funeral home, the phone company, Ma Bell, would have to put one at your house. So we had 3 phones hanging on the kitchen wall. So my dad would call the house, and my grandmother on my mom's side lived with us. And he'd just tell my grandmother, he said, Granny, get the phones. We're getting ready to go down and open a casket at a funeral. So when the funeral home phone would ring, it'd ring at our house, and my grandmother would just pick it up. And if it was an ambulance call, they might know my grandmother because they knew us in the community. They might say, Virginia, Bill's having a heart attack, over here. And she knew where Bill lived. You know what I mean? It might be over on Chestnut Street. So she'd keep calling the back line at the funeral until my dad answered.
To get him to go over there.
And she'd say, hey, you've got an emergency over at the Good House. Someone's having a heart attack. Well, if we got there, and of course, you got to keep in mind, I'm, second grade, I'm 7 or 8 years old. And back then, I got to be honest with you, not everyone wore seatbelts either. Yeah. And my dad smokes Benson & Hedges cigarettes. I can still remember my dad have a Benson & Hedges cigarette lit up, and he'd be driving the ambulance, and the other helper, one of our helpers, would be on the passenger side, and they'd put me in the middle and say, hey, you want to go with us? And I'd sit on a pillow, and my dad'd say, flip the switch, and I'd flip the switch, and when he honked the horn, the siren would go, and we'd go blazing through town. But where I was going with this, the whole point is sometimes we'd get there, and my dad knew they were probably already deceased. But he also knew where they went to church at. So we'd get in the car, and then he'd get on the radio and call the sheriff's department, and our call numbers were 246. And he'd be calling in 246 to the sheriff's department. They'd get on there, and then my dad would tell the dispatcher, reach the pastor at the First Baptist Church and tell him we're taking Mr. Good in, and we need him to be there at the ER. And then my dad would meet that preacher. He'd rush over there, and my dad would tell the pastor, said, I don't think he made it. Mm-hmm. Then my dad would always stay outside of the ER room, mm-hmm. and then the pastor would go in and be the blown of bad news. And then my dad would step up and say, Miss Good, do you want me to take Bill back to the funeral home and go ahead and get started? And she'd say, I think you better, Ray. And my dad would either call the funeral home back and tell the guys, say, hey, bring a car down and take Miss Good home.
Well, that's service and, efficient.
And those days, I got to tell you, those days are gone.
No, I don't mean to giggle about it, but I mean, compared to what we have now, that is such a different
I tell you,
setup.
Another thing we used to do in the funerals, and we weren't the only ones that did it, but the other thing we used to do too, there was no such thing as these companies that now, let's say you're on oxygen all the time, and they have these little electric oxygen machines you keep in the house. If you've got, bronchitis or something, you need oxygen, or if you have emphysema, there was none of that. There was no such thing.
So you guys would bring the oxygen too.
Oh yeah, there was no such thing too as I can't tell you through high school. People would call my dad, or they'd come down, and he might get $10 or $5 a month, or he wouldn't charge, but they say, Ray, we need a hospital bed, and they weren't electric. These were the kind that hand cranked to the foot. Mm-hmm. So my dad, as a high summer job, he'd say, John, you and Bob go out to the house and set a hospital bed up. Well, who do you think they were going to call as a funeral home when that person passed away? Or if they need, and then when I'm talking about oxygen tanks we'd have to take out there, these were like the big green tanks like you fill helium balloons up out of, Mm-hmm. And we had an agreement with an auto parts store, and he would order them and keep them on his back dock. So someone might call our house or call the funeral home at 8 o'clock at night and say, Ray, I think, Jim's oxygen just ran out. We need another tank. Well, we'd have to get we had an old station wagon. We hauled those things in. It was an old green Dodge station wagon with push buttons on the dash. And we'd have to go get one of those tanks. And some of my high school buddies were shocked when I was 14 or 15 years old. They go, how do you know how to do this? And I'd take a crescent wrench and unscrew the valve off of it, screw the new valve on, and I'd turn it on, and you'd put it up to your nose and feel the air coming through, and I go, there you are, you're good to go. And
wow. Now, how did your dad get into that at 16? Because that was before the GI Bill.
I have to tell you, my dad had a twin brother named Roy. My dad's name was Ray, and my uncle was he was a cowboy. My grandfather was a cowboy through and through. They ran cattle. My uncle was an auctioneer, and my grandparents always told me the story about how they called the doctor. That's back when doctors still made home visits and carried the black bags. Called the doctor and said they thought there was something wrong with my dad. And he said, what's the problem? They thought it was a psychological problem. Said he's always burying my aunt's dolls out in the backyard. And so when the doctor sat my dad down and talked to him, said, Ray, why do you do that? And lo and behold, they never knew that my dad had been riding his bike down 2 blocks down was the funeral home. And my dad would go down there and visit with those guys, and they'd talk to him. And my dad was so impressed with their black cars and everything, and how they'd, be out there waxing the cars and stuff. So he'd been hanging around down there, and a couple of times without them knowing it, he rode out to the cemetery with the funeral director. And so my dad just, he liked the funeral business. So when he's 16 years old, he went to work for a funeral home. And then what happened is the other funeral home that wasn't far away from there would be, he was in Miami, Oklahoma, and this funeral director from Miami would drive over to Joplin to the hospital to drop a patient off. And the funeral my dad was at, he would stop by there and pick my dad up. He asked my dad, he said, hey, why don't you come back to work for me and I'll pay you $1 more an hour. And my dad did it. And which was really, I guess, kind of a blessing, because that man ended up helping my dad through mortuary school when he got out of the service and everything. And the rest was history.
Yeah. Now, did you always know that you wanted to do that?
Well, I tell you what, I think a lot had to do with because I was the only son, 3 older sisters, so I was always with my dad a lot. And I could ride my bike to the funeral home. And if you talk to my sisters, they'll tell you I was kind of spoiled. And I remember my dad had the guys out the cemetery in the wintertime when there wasn't a lot to do and no mowing. They made me a go-kart, a motorized go-kart. And I'd go out to the cemetery and ride this go-kart all around the cemetery.
That sounds fun.
And as time went on, it's like anybody, if you're a fireman or policeman and you're young and, the red lights and the siren going to the ambulance, you thought, man, I'd like to do this. So I was down there a lot. And I remember one time, I think I was about in the 3rd or 4th grade. My dad told my mom, he said, hey, I ordered John a birthday cake for his birthday. I ordered the cake. And my mom thought it was kind of weird because my grandmother was a heck of a baker and she cooked all our meals and baked with. She enjoyed doing that. And one thing my parents, they liked, we always had big birthday parties. Now, they weren't fancy, but we invited every kid in the 4-state area and we, cook hot dogs and all that stuff, roast hot dogs. Well, here comes this birthday cake. And I could tell something was wrong because my mom was like looking at my dad like, what were you thinking? And my grandmother walked her and looked at it. She goes, are you serious? And I was thought, well, what could be wrong with the cake? Well, I looked in there. It was a black hearse. And on the hearse, it said Ireland and Son.
Oh, wow.
And from then on.
When was that?
Oh, I was born in 61. So it had to be in the 70s, when he did that. And
it's pretty cool.
That happened about every year from then on. So, yeah. And that's really all I knew.
That's a sweet story.
I knew all I knew, I mowed yards all through high school, and that's back when you got $3.50 for a yard, So
how do you think that, being immersed in this since childhood has shaped your views on life and death?
Well, I got to tell you, when I first went in the funeral business, it was what I call the old school. And then when I got out of mortuary school, my dad actually passed away while I was in mortuary school. But my dad always told me, he said, go to work for a guy named Eisenhower in Del City. His name was Bill Eisenhower. And I said, why am I going there? He said, because he's a hard guy to work for. But he's successful. And you'll learn. You might think you know the funeral business, but he said, until the day you die, you're going to continue to learn. And he said, don't ever quit learning. You can always learn from somebody or something. And so I did. And he was a heck of a teacher. He'd always say, if on a funeral, he'd tell you, he said, I'll help you if you can take constructive criticism. Now, his idea of constructive criticism, mine are two different things, because I always felt like I was getting chewed out. You know what I mean? But he was a good teacher. And, but cremation had just started to rise, and it was really growing. And the biggest mistake on a national level, is funeral directors, they knew how to combat it or to deal with it, but they did a poor job doing it. And it in anything, I don't care if you're selling cars, I don't care if you're selling furniture, if you're selling carpet, you're selling advertisement. There's sometimes a bad apple in everything, And there were those funeral directors that were probably money hungry, maybe the maximum, they tried to get the maximum out of everything. And, but, funerals were high. I mean, some people got the maximum price they could get for funerals, but that doesn't mean the families had to use those funeral homes either. Mm-hmm. I mean, there was always an option.
So what do you mean they didn't integrate cremation or?
Well, they didn't come out and tell the importance and role of a funeral director. They didn't see the other side of it. They didn't preach the value of a funeral. Mm-hmm. They didn't preach the value of when someone passes away. The grief starts when you accept it. You view a deceased and accept the fact that there has been a death occurred. Mm-hmm. And that didn't happen.
It cut the process.
Yes, big time. Yeah. And there's some big companies out there on a national level that are very good that just specialize in marketing and advertising for funeral homes. And there's one in particular that I've called 2 or 3 times, and I've reviewed some of their advertisements and stuff to learn from them. And I asked one of the ladies at this, and they're a huge marketing firm, they're back east, and I said, why didn't on a national level funeral directors embrace this? She goes, it's not a matter of fact that they didn't embrace. There was too many chiefs and not enough Indians, and they couldn't decide the direction to go. And to this day, there's times I'm a firm believer in my profession. I'm a firm believer in what I do, and there are some people who think, well, funerals are just high, they're ridiculous now, and they have gotten high and they have gotten ridiculous. The large corporations got involved in it, and they got on the stock exchange. Give you an example. If you came to our funeral home and you need us to get a grave open for you, it's $795. Go 5 blocks down the road, it's $2,500.
Whoa.
And
do y'all do everything there in-house? Most everything?
Yeah, pretty much. I tell you, I use a mortuary service a lot too. And back in the day when I first started opening up my funeral home in 95, my dad always said there's 3 things that if you learn and you learn art of them, you can work anywhere you want to work. That's mow the yard and make sure the yard of the funeral home looks perfectionist. Okay? Keep your cars extremely clean. And back then, everyone used white walls. Scrub the white walls on the hearses to make sure the cars are clean. My dad always used to lecture me, your entire car can be clean, but if the white wall's dirty, the whole car looks dirty. And learn to embalm a body. And there's an art to doing it. And there is. And one thing that was a blessing, some of the old guys that went to school with my dad had a knack for restorative art, reconstructing maybe a nose and ear or reconstructing a face from a traumatized death. I was blessed with that. And, but the thing is, my funeral home, I told the banker when I put my funeral home in, I wanted to do 25 funerals my first year and I could make it. And that's before cremation had really, it was still growing, but not then. And I went to my mom and I asked for some family inheritance. She goes, no, you don't need any. She goes, you go see the banker. She goes, if it doesn't work out, you come back and see me, but your dad wants you to do it. You know the funeral business. So I went back to the banker and said, hey, I need to borrow some money from you. And he said, if you change your plan to 50 funerals a year, I'll give you the money. And I did. And I think I did 78 funerals my first year. And, but I was one of those that just kept buying equipment, putting it back, buying equipment, putting it back. So I didn't have a lot of debt when I started out. But I knew that I had to give really good service. The problem now with funeral business, the Federal Trade Commission got involved, which everyone said, oh, thank God the government's getting involved, the Federal Trade Commission's getting involved. Really, that was kind of detrimental to the consumer, because when the government came out, said, we want every funeral director using the same form on their prices. Well, boy, they get to looking at this thing, and they're thinking, oh, Toledo, we weren't charging for this. We weren't charging for that. And next thing you know, there's 25 things on there that the funeral director never really even charged for. Well, then what do you think happened?
They started charging.
They started charging. And that's what happens. You get bureaucracy involved in something that they really know nothing about. I mean, the funeral prices even started going higher then. And, used to be you came into a funeral home, you paid one price and it was for a visitation. You might be there 3 nights. You might be there a week. That's all the funeral director charged. Federal government comes out and says, well, you should be charging not only by the day, you might even charge every 2 hours. I mean, that was crazy. But what do you think happened?
People started doing it.
Funeral directors took it and went with it. And that hurt the funeral business. And, but so now what helped me is when I put my place in, I didn't do that. I stayed old school, and people really appreciated me for it because they might shop around for a price and come back in and think, well, you're not going to charge that? Nah, that's my price right there. If you're here 1 day or 3 days, just come and go as you please, and the coffee's always on. These are our hours. And that's just how it used to be, And so it's really a different thing. And one thing that's driven cremation up too is you have to keep in mind. I'll give you an example. And I did it myself. When I opened up, I'd have caskets in the selection room when you come in, and they might have in the head panel say "In God's Care." They might have "Going Home," and there'd be 3 birds going one direction. This bird's going home. There might be praying hands in it. There might be a casket with the 23rd Psalm in it. Well, those days are few and far between. And even my kids, all 3 of my kids and my 2 nephews who I raised as my sons because their dad died at a young age, and they're my sister's boys, they've seen it too. And the reason we don't have those caskets, now we have panels we can put in, but you have to keep in mind, back when my dad was in business and I was going through it, everyone turned out for a visitation the night before. Mm-hmm. You saw the family, then everyone showed up at the church. It was Amazing Grace, Peace in the Valley, In the Garden, and then everyone went to the cemetery. After the funeral, you went and had some of the best fried chicken and peach cobbler you've ever eaten, that made a big meal. That's over with. But one of the reasons it's over with is you're up to about 60% of the population who are not affiliated with the church anymore. So they're not at a ceremony 4 times a week, and some have church on Wednesday night. And so that was a norm. You did that. There was a lot of times, that you went to the church for the service because they were at church. Now it's...
So you think that because they were already really active in church, they were just naturally inclined to show up for services or funeral services?
Absolutely.
And then to want
absolutely.
to have
I can see
how absolutely. And that's just connected. Not the case anymore.
Yeah,
you can have 5 kids in an arrangement room, all grown adults, 35 to 55. Their mom's in her 80s, and when you're helping them write the obituary, they're saying, hey, put in there that mom read her Bible every day. Read it every day. Watch John Hagee on TBN. Even when she got homebound, she watched it every Sunday. And so, we want that in there. She's dedicated to her church, never missed Sunday school. Well, then when you're deciding where the funeral is going to be and you say, are we going to go to a church? And then this son over here says, well, we're not really in church because we're in Little League baseball or traveling baseball, so we're gone every weekend. We don't really remember a church. And the sister over said, well, our daughter, Sally, she's in traveling dance, and we're going to be in Dallas this weekend. We don't have a minister. But go ahead and get us a minister, John, and have him come in and say a few words. We're going to do it here in chapel. Tell him to keep it short. Don't do any altar calls. And, so it's just changed. I mean, there's not that church affiliation anymore.
Right. Can you tell me what an altar call is?
That's when during a service, the pastor asks if you haven't given your life to Christ, if you'd like to do it at this time.
So that's a common thing for funeral directors to include.
Not funeral directors.
Churches.
And there's some churches that do it, some won't.
Pastors. Okay.
So and they're telling him not to do it.
Yeah, I see that. I mean, we have experience with that in my own family.
Yeah, I will say this. Catholics are still pretty traditional.
Yes.
They are unless their kids have left the parish and haven't been involved in a long time, they want to have a mass for their loved one, even if it's a cremation, but they have no really desire to be there. They're just doing it because they feel obligated because their mother was a Catholic or their dad was a Catholic. Mm-hmm. But they've left the church, Well,
a lot of people will have things 6 months later,
Yeah,
services.
I tell you this, I'm a big believer in prepaid funeral plans. Big believer in it.
I believe in it as well.
Because number one, you make wiser decisions when you're not so emotional. Mm-hmm. And you know where your finances are. You have things when you do a pre-need, you get things in order. It is shocking to me about the people who come into the funeral home, and I'm talking well-educated people. People only think about funerals when they've had a death in their family, their neighbor dies or a coworker dies or maybe a church member. Then it's on their mind for about 3 days to 7 days after the fact, and they think, hey, let's go in and talk to John and let's talk about it. Do they go through with it? Maybe. Then they get to talking to their kids, and a daughter says, oh, you don't want to do that right now. We'll deal with it. Well, they really should have done with it right now. And because a lot of people will come in, and I mean, we're talking educated people. They have no idea about their parents' finances, or mom's gotten sick and she's going to need around-the-clock care. Dad's battling Alzheimer's.
That's where long-term care comes in.
And they didn't get a trust, and they should have gotten a trust because it should have been set up 5 years prior to, because then they're coming back in during the funeral arrangements, or they're coming back in 2 months later and saying, hey, can you help us? And we'll say, we'll sit down. What's the problem? Well, the government's wanting to take Dad's house. We got to liquidate all the assets. You guys have buried Mom. They didn't have a trust, and they're telling us this. And had you had that all set up, and it's that runs into problems, runs into big time financial problems.
Well, that's ultimately why I came up with the Life and Legacy List. I haven't mentioned that on the podcast yet, but it is a new magazine that I've come out with. It's going to be Oklahoma's first dedicated guide to end-of-life care. And John happens to be my very first advertiser. I'm so excited about that.
It's coming out in March.
It'll come out in April. Yes. The website's already live. But ultimately, the idea is to get people to think about these things before it's, an emotional upheaval time for you. And so the Life and Legacy List is really just for that. It's to encourage people to think about these things before it's too late. And, that's exactly what I want people to think about. A trust, the ways to protect your legacy, your family's legacy, your own legacy, start planning now. And that's one of the things that I talk about often is how my grandmother, she gifted our family with that pre-planning. She had hers and my grandfather's funeral arrangements, as well as their burial plot. Everything was all picked out beforehand. And, she wanted to show me while she was still alive. And at that point in my life, I was not open to that concept. I thought it was kind of cruel. I don't want to think about my grandparents dying. I didn't at that moment. And so I told her no. And I didn't realize what a gift it was until my grandfather did die, and he had such a troubled death that it really was the last thing that we needed to be thinking about was all of the business details of his death. And, she had already taken care of all of that. So it really did allow us to grieve and give us the space to be there for each other and to comfort each other instead of having to worry about all of these details. So, I really appreciate that. I know, especially coming from somebody in the funeral industry that sees it pretty much every day, right?
Absolutely. And I tell you there used to be two types of plans, funeral plans, and I think this is important. Oklahoma went to now what you have to have is an insured policy. There used to be you could have a trust. And the difference between an insured policy and a trust, people would come in and say, hey, we're just going to take out a trust, or the funeral director would say, I'm going to write you up on a trust. And you would pick your merchandise out, pick what funeral you wanted. Then you would pay him, he would take the money and put it in a bank account. You would pay he would draw the interest, you would pay the taxes on it. Well, the problem with those trusts is that funeral director, if he wanted to, he could move that money, which, there again, there's always some bad apples in the business. They could get his hands on the money. You didn't want those. The best policy to have is what they call an insured policy. And that's all I've ever offered is an insured policy. And what happens is a family comes in, picks their policies out, it's through an insurance company that only specializes in prepaid funeral plans. And that's what anybody wants. And the reason you want it is because the funeral home has a copy, the people who took the policy has a copy, the insured company has a copy, and every year you have to file those with the state insurance commissioner's office, along with the insurance company. They give a printout, and your money's protected. That if the funeral home was to go broke, the funeral home was to close down, your money's never touched. That money can't be touched till the death occurs, with the exception of this. And that's why you should always have your policies marked irrevocable. Unfortunately, through the years, as time's gone on, have passed by, unfortunately, this has happened, and the district attorney's gotten involved, and those policies, say, for example, you came in and saw me and you wanted a funeral and you wanted to go to the Catholic church, you paid for your opening, closing, put it in there too, you paid for a funeral. And then lo and behold, baby brother gets in trouble at Riverwind. And he comes in without any of the family knowing it. Mom and dad didn't think that ever happened. He's listed as a beneficiary. Any money left over in those policies goes back to the beneficiary. And he says, changing plans, I need to cash that policy in. And you tell him, say, you can't cash that policy. He says, well, I can actually cash it in. Now I'm not getting all the money back. And you won't. You lose a lot. Then what happens is when the policy's cashed in, which they're putting a stop to that, the other brothers and sisters have no idea that the brothers came in and has done that. And then mom's died and they think everything's paid for. And you got to tell them, well, 2 years ago, your brother came in and needed money. And then they break the news, oh, my Lord, he's lost everything from gambling debts and everything. The other thing that's bad, too, about policies that really does upset me, and I just had a funeral director call me, and I say this jokingly because he called up and he said, hey, I need an older funeral director to give me some advice here. And I go, are you saying I'm old? And because I don't look at myself that way now, but I guess I am. But what happens too is a couple comes in, takes their funerals out, and this isn't about money. It's about what they picked out, what they wanted, all the way down to the songs. Mm-hmm. And they've picked out a funeral, they've paid for it, and there's $12,000 in that account. They've got it down to a T, what you're supposed to give the pastor. We want red and white carnations. There's money set aside for this. But this relative member decides, I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to do a direct cremation. As a matter of fact, I want the cheapest thing I can get. And if you can't do it for $1,000, I'll go to a cremation house where I can get it even cheaper than that. And those people get none of what they picked out. He's taken the money and gone with it. He goes and has just the body picked up and have him cremated. Now the district attorney has passed it's a gray area that you can't do that to someone. If those couples came in or individual came in and they want a military funeral, they want to be taken to Fort Sill, then you want to cancel it out and take the money. That's not right.
Yeah, that's not right.
The problem you get into is that family member goes and he gets an attorney to fight you, and they're going to eat the money up trying to get the money back.
Well, that's why conversations with your family are so important.
Very,
and that's something we advocate for. I'm sure you do as
important.
Well. Yeah,
very important.
Yeah.
Well, we are running short on time.
I was curious. Do you have anybody that wants to be in business with you?
That wants to take after you?
Anybody in your family or?
Yeah, my daughter. She went to. I put two of my kids and my two of my children, my son and daughter, and my oldest nephew. They went to school at OU. My son knows the funeral business inside and out and specialized on the prepaid side, but he's now a lieutenant in the Marine Corps. He always wanted to do that, and one day he told me, he said, "Hey, I need to talk to you." And I thought he'd wrecked a car. And he told me, he said, "I've joined the Marines." And I'll never forget, I stood up. I don't know why I said this to him. I said, "You joined the Marines?" He goes, "Yeah." I go, "Keep your mouth shut and I'll get you out of this. Let me do all the talking." And he goes, I don't want out. I go, yes, you do. You're not thinking straight. But he's an officer in the Marine Corps. And then my oldest daughter has a clothing store and candy store, and she's partners with my youngest daughter. But my youngest daughter, she came to me and said, hey, I need a check for tuition. I thought she was going to go to OU. And I said, well, when did you go to OU to enroll? She goes, I didn't. I went to UCO and I'm going to mortuary school. And I said, are you crazy? And because we're a little different. I don't ever go to an answering service. Those infuriate me when I call to get a haircut and got to wait for someone to get online.
Right.
So we answer our own phones 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And it is a confining, we're on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Wow, that's awesome. Can you tell us how to get it? Can you tell our listeners how to find you?
Yes.
Yeah, we have a funeral home in our main locations in Moore. It's our main location, 120 South Broadway in Moore, and they can reach me there. We have also a chapel in Oklahoma City at 32nd and Western. We are just finished up and getting ready to open a funeral home in Jones, Oklahoma, and we're going to go out to Jones. Nice. And then we have an interest in a couple other funeral homes that aren't under our name that we're involved in.
Well, I'm so excited to get to hear about you and your.
Well, I think it's a pleasure to be here, and I think your magazine, everything you're doing to enlighten listeners and to make them more aware. I think it's great what you all are doing.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that.
Yeah, and thank you so much for sharing stories and insights. And
you bet.
Welcome to come back anytime. And just want to say to our listeners, stay tuned for our next episodes where we continue to explore all things death, dying, grief, and what it means to live a fuller life. Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Thanks, John.
Thank you for joining us as we journey through life's most enigmatic reality. I'm Jennifer O'Neill.
And I'm Sarah Kovash.
And we are
the Death Doula Duo.
The Death Doula Duo is brought to you by the Possibilities podcast platform.
If you have comments, suggestions, or would like to be on the show, please email us at thedeathdouladuo@gmail.com. Until next time, may all your discussions about death be lively.